Happy Father's Day. You know, if you're into that kind of thing. I thought about starting out the message this morning with some really weird or off-putting Father's Day or, dad joke, basically. But I decided to go the higher route, and instead I wanted to share some good news. In light of pandemic things and COVID things, I always like listening to stories of things reopening, which is always really exciting. And the latest one that I read, it was actually just this morning, is Legoland in St. Louis reopened. Must be a really popular place. People were just, around the block waiting in line. You'll get that later. It was a really bad joke. Read it this morning. I'm like, that is probably the worst dad joke I've ever read in my life. It was just horrible. Okay, so Psalms is where we are. We have started a new sermon series. About time, right? So last week, David started us out with Psalms 1. Today we are going to be in Psalms 2. Now, our plan right now is to not just go chapter by chapter in Psalms, okay? We're not gonna do every single one, okay? But we are gonna be in order, okay? We didn't want to skip Psalm 1 and Psalm 2. We did want to put them next to each other because they're significant. They kind of go together, okay? But the big thing that we want to understand while we're going through Psalms, okay, is just like the little tag that we have up there, is it's the heart of God's people. The entire point of Psalms is this idea that we all have different emotions and different ways we react to things in life, right? And Psalms usually can hit every single one of those emotions. Whether if you're super joyful and happy and everything's going your way, Psalms will lead you and guide you on how to worship God in those ways, okay? But the thing is, even whenever you don't feel like it, when you're low, when you're in a dark place, when your faith is just hanging on by a thread, Psalms is there too. And they can still point you to God and help you worship Him. Okay? And that's like the big thing that we want to understand as we're going through Psalms. And that's why we kind of said it's the heart of God's people. Because that's what we're talking about, emotions, right? We're talking about living real life, okay? And pointing it to worshiping God. All right? Now, Psalms 2 specifically is a really big messianic Psalms, okay? It's a really big one. There's a few... let's call it a coronation type Psalms, okay? There's a few of them throughout the whole book. Psalms 2, in my opinion anyways, is one of the coolest ones, okay? So I'm really excited to get into this. So anyway, it's a messianic psalm, okay, which basically means king, all right? We're talking about a king this morning, okay? That's the big thing that we're going to be pointing to. Now, I understand that in Western American culture, when we say king, we don't really have a personal reference for that. We have knowledge of a king and what they do and how they operate. We have knowledge of it, but we can't personally relate to the idea of a king, right? Even in church, we like to say all the time, Jesus is king. But if we have to be honest with ourselves, we most of the time kind of go, I don't really know what that means. I mean, he's in charge. That's about all I got, right? The closest thing that we probably have in Western American culture is a president, right? That's probably the closest thing we can get. And when we are talking about Psalms 2 and this being a coronation, the closest thing that we can get is, whenever the president says, yes, I solemnly swear to lead the country, that kind of, that's a ceremony. I forget what it's called, but whatever. But anyway, that's the closest thing that we have to relate to that. But even then, that quickly loses its air, right? It kind of deflates pretty quickly because we soon realize the president doesn't make all the decisions, right? He doesn't have complete power. He doesn't have complete authority. That's not his job. That's not his role, okay? And actually, we set it up that way, right? Us Americans, we set it up that way to where he didn't have all the control, all the power, all the authority. We did that on purpose because we saw what absolute power can do in the wrong hands, right? The whole idea, power corrupts, right? So we did everything we could to fight against that. Checks and balances, 3 different branches of government. I mean, we set up lots of systems and things in place so that way not one person can have all of the power, right? And this is what is ingrained in us. This is what we understand. This is how we view power. We view authority as this idea of something that you have to fight against. Or it's like, well, yeah, he is in charge, but we need to make sure he's not too much in charge. And it's just this natural battle that we have, okay? And not that it's wrong, because let's be honest, we as humans should not rule ourselves with absolute power, authority, absolute control. We just shouldn't. We tried that. That's how we got in this mess, right? We tried to rule ourselves. We decided we didn't need God. We can do this ourselves, grab the fruit, take the bite, and everything broke. So we tried that, and it didn't work. Therefore, we are afraid of power. We're afraid of authority. We're afraid of that kind of stuff, because we tried it, and it didn't work. But yet, we like this idea of a king or someone that does have all of that power that can come in and just fix everything, right? I mean, think about whenever a new president comes to into office. Pick a president, Clinton, Obama, I don't care, right? Pick a president. But whenever he comes up, there's always this hype of now everything is going to be fixed. All the mistakes the last president made, this one's going to fix them all, right? And that's like the mindset that a lot of people go into. But it's just not true. And why is that not true? One, human. There's no way that they could fix all of the problems. And two, they don't have the power, they don't have the authority, and they don't have the control to do that. They can't snap their fingers and fix all the problems. They don't have the power. So what are we left with? We're left with this love-hate relationship with this idea of absolute power and kingship. We hate the idea of someone totally in charge and in complete control of our lives, but we love the idea of someone who has that power to fix everything. And we constantly fight against the two. Because let's be honest, we are called as Christians to give Jesus king and all authority of our lives. We mention it all the time. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, meaning Jesus, right? We say it all the time, and we like to say that. But if we have to be honest with ourselves, we don't like the idea of giving someone besides us all authority, because it's something that's ingrained in us. We want to rule ourselves, but we also want someone to fix it. And you can't have both. Now, we cannot have a proper discussion about king and kingdom and all of that without a reference to Lord of the Rings. Duh, right? You cannot have this discussion. So, Lord of the Rings, if you watch the movies at all, okay, I know my wife's already shaking her head. If you watch the movies at all, especially if you start from The Hobbit all the way to The Return of the King, okay, if you want to watch if you have that kind of time on your hands, go for it, right? But if you watch all the movies, it's easy to get emotionally invested in the characters. Is it because the movies are really great? The movies are fine. But J.R.R. Tolkien is just a great storyteller. Just as an author, he's a good storyteller. You can get just as emotionally invested with the actual paper, physical books. And people might argue that, and that's fine. But you get really emotionally invested in these characters because of the way he writes them. He does a really good job. And one of the main characters is Aragorn, right? He's the guy who eventually becomes king in the very last movie. Okay? Spoiler alert. All right? It's Return of the King. Never mind. So anyways, he finally becomes king in the very last movie. But the really cool thing about his character is through the entire storyline, he fights against that. He's like, no, that's not for me. I'm going to screw it up. I'm going to mess it up. I'm not good enough to become king. And there's two parts. It's like, yeah, one, he doesn't feel like he's good enough. But the other part is he respects and understands the authority that comes with that crown. And he doesn't know if he can handle it or not. He respects the power and the authority. Respects it. Okay? So then, yes, eventually, at the very end, he becomes king. And he's already been painted as this picture of the good king that everybody wants. The one that isn't going to be corrupted. The one that isn't going to be swayed by evil and darkness because he's destroyed it all before he even became king. He's that good king that we finally get. So anyways, in the movie, we actually have a coronation at the end of the movie, right? And he gets the crown on his head. And I actually wrote this down because it's a really good quote from the movie. It says, "This day does not belong to one man, but to all. Let us gather together, rebuild this world that we may share in the days of peace." The good king has finally come to power, and he has complete authority and fixes everything. And we fantasize about things like this. Not a dry eye in the theater during that scene, if you're into that. But okay, let's say Lord of the Rings, you shut down as soon as I started saying that. Well, maybe you could relate to another story. King Arthur. How many people have ever heard of King Arthur? Raise your hand. Come on, King Arthur. Everyone knows King Arthur. Okay, so King Arthur, it's the same exact thing, right? I've never heard a story where King Arthur was the bad guy. I've never heard a story like that. I'm sure it exists, but I've never seen one. I've never heard of one where he's the bad guy. It's because we are fantasizing about this idea of the good king that comes to power and fixes everything. But yet in real life, we fight against it. Because we don't want to give up power. We don't want to give up the authority of ourselves. Why is it so hard to make that jump between fantasizing about stuff like King Aragorn and King Arthur? We all want this idea, and whenever it's actually true, we fight against it. This is that love-hate relationship. Now, maybe you're not a fantasy person. I understand. But there's still two concepts that you can wrap your head around here, okay? One is the good leader, right, that rises above and sets everything right. Just that general concept. You can grab a hold of that. Or just simply the other one, good and light triumphs over darkness and evil. Right? I mean, that's the general concept here. But in order to triumph over evil and darkness and bad things, the light has to be uncorruptible. And that's not us. That's not us. It has to be God as the only uncorruptible light. He's the one who deserves control. He's the one that deserves authority. And he's the one that has the power to set everything right. So why do we fight against that? Well, we fight against that in vain, ultimately, right? Because at the end of the day, and like I said, we're going to read here in Psalms 2, the main thing that we realize is, right, it's a chapter about a king. It's a chapter about a coronation of a king, meaning Jesus. It's a chapter of God saying he's king, he's power, he's authority, and he's in charge. But here's the fun part. That love-hate relationship that makes us all uncomfortable, you don't have a choice. Because the kingdom is established. And it doesn't matter what you think. To be blunt about it. So whenever we have, like I said, that love-hate relationship where we battle against authority, where we battle against power, but ultimately it's a power that we can't fight against, right? But we still try, right? We have our own ways that we say, you know what, I'm just going to go do my own thing. I don't need to be here. I don't need this questioning of everything I do. All I do is I go to church and they make me feel about that big because it's like, you're a sinful person. Right? I don't need people questioning my lifestyle, anything like that. So you go and do your own thing, all of that. Well, I love this. Let's go ahead and get into Psalms 2. And I want to read verse 4 first. Okay? He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. He laughs. I'm just going to let us bask in that for a second, that he's laughing. What's he laughing at? Let's back up and read verses 1 through 3 real quick. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. All these different ways that Earth's leaders, or not even leaders, just anybody in general, are having this idea that, you know what, I am going to ignore that authority. I'm going to do how I want. I'm going to plot in vain. I love that, right? But I'm going to plot and figure out however I want to live my life. I'm going to do what I want. And God, in verse 4, says, I'm laughing at you. That's funny. That you actually think, even though you're choosing to walk away from my authority, that you're no longer under it. That's hilarious to me. Picture this, and dads, I'm sure you can relate to this. This is the only dad reference to the whole thing, by the way. But think about your kid coming up and trying to swing and punch you, and you're just holding their head out like this. Anyone ever done that? Anyone? Yeah, you're just holding that, and they're trying to punch you, and you're just like, that's adorable. Yeah. This is the picture we're looking at here, right? These rulers, these grand rulers are trying to do whatever they want, take authority over their lives, be apart from God, and he's like, that's cute. That's real funny. It doesn't matter what we do. He has all authority. He is in complete control, and he knows it. So anytime you feel like, you know what, I know what I should do, but I'm going to choose to ignore anything the Bible teaches. I'm going to choose to ignore all of that and live life however I want, and there's no possible way that God will find me. You need to understand that he's just sitting up there and laughing at you, thinking, he really thinks he has a choice in this. Now here's the other side of this, that he's laughing. We're talking about God, the person who could, by a snap of his fingers, could make the earth turn to dust and completely destroy everything. Absolutely everything. Make it non-existent, like it never was here, gone completely. But what we get here in verse 4 is not, he who sits in the heavens destroys everything. No, we get, he laughs. Just like if my son or daughter or whatever would come up and try to punch me in the leg and I just held them back like that, it's like, I'm not threatened by them. There is no threat here. I'm laughing because I think it's cute. But I also, in my complete wisdom and complete grace, know eventually they're going to grow up and learn better. And that's how we're viewed. Not as something to destroy in Psalm 2 here, but something that God has patience with because he just finds it funny. I'm just holding him back. So there's hope there. This is actually this picture of hope, of God saying, no, I don't want to kill them. I don't want to wipe them from the face of the earth. I don't want to destroy them. I want to love them, even if they choose not to love me. It's a very hopeful thing. It's a really, really neat thing to kind of read into. I want to actually go ahead and read the rest of Psalm 2. We're going to start on verse 6 and go all the way down real quick, okay? So now we're going to get a little bit more into the actual coronation part of this, okay? So starting in verse 6. As for me, I have set my king on Zion. Another way to think about it, just like on Jerusalem, on the main throne of earth kind of idea, if you want to think of it that way. My holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now, therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way. For his wrath is quickly kindled. Are all who take refuge in him. I want everyone to catch the picture here. Think of the coronation of a king, all right? And they're saying not only does this guy have complete power, he is the nations are your heritage, the earth is your possession. So he has power and authority over everything that we could possibly imagine. And what does he have the power to do? To break them with a rod of iron, to dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. He's given a power to just completely wipe us from the face of the earth. Complete power. Now, therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. This is not a promise as so much as a warning. Right? This is not the promised king to be. No, this king has been established. Do this or else. Right? That's like the more correct idea here. Don't worry, there's an upside to this, okay? But I just want us to grasp this idea of how much authority and the kingship of Jesus and what that means, all right? So verse 11, serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Why are we rejoicing and trembling? We're going to get to that here in a second, actually. Lest he be angry and you perish in the way. I want to make sure that we also understand that this kingdom was established a long time ago. All right? This is not something that we can run away from. This is not something like, well, I'll be sure I'm out of here before it happens. No, it doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter how far you run. Doesn't matter how you hide. This has already happened. The kingdom is already established, and Jesus is already on the throne. Do we understand that? I'm not going to sit back here and be like, well, one day. No, it's already happened. And this king that is on the throne and that has all of this authority that is laid out in Psalms 2 has the power to snap his fingers and get rid of every single one of us. Why would he want to do that? Because of sin, right? We all have sin in us. We all have sin around us. We are a world of sin. Remember the whole we tried to rule ourselves thing and we broke it? Yeah, that's on us. That's our fault. So we are covered in sin. The sin is in us. It's around us. It's in you. It's in you. And we're battling against each other and we're feeding off of one another and the sin's just keeping bigger and bigger. And what's the one way to completely eradicate sin from the earth? To kill every single one of us. You cannot destroy sin without destroying us. That's the only way to do it. Right? So what's he do instead? He has the power to do that. He goes, you know what? This place, it's broke. Let's start over. Snap his fingers, get rid of all of us. The sin's gone. Start over. Why not do it that way? He has the power to do that. But instead of using his power for that, this grand king on this grand throne with all of that, instead of destroying every single one of us, we get Romans 5. Romans 5:6. For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person we would dare even to die. Verse 8. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. I actually have the rest of it written down, but I'm going to stop there. I don't think we need to go any further. Christ died so we don't have to. All of that he has, the crown, all of that was given to him as we read in his coronation in Psalms 2. What does he do with that power? He chooses to die so we can live. That's what our king does. He sacrifices his life on a cross and allows his blood to drain out of his body and cover all of our sins. So that way we can enter the kingdom and be one with him. That's what he does. We talk about absolute light, uncorruptible light. That's what that looks like. Not choosing power to destroy, but to save, to rescue, and to redeem. That's what Jesus does. the most powerful figure that you can imagine in any of these fantasy stories, King Arthur, all of these giants of kingdom. And Jesus is above all of that, and he chooses to take on the image of a sacrificial lamb, one of the lowliest and weakest creatures you can imagine. That's what our King does. And maybe you're not an avid churchgoer. Maybe you don't really get the idea. Okay, well, sacrificial lamb. What do you mean? That means nothing. I hear that all the time. What's that mean? Well, let me just give a quick idea of what that means. Okay, in Old Testament times, that's what the Israelites would use to cover their sins. Okay, they would literally take a little lamb and slaughter it on the altar. Okay, the altar of God. And then the blood of that lamb would be sprinkled on the altar, in other places actually, but it would be sprinkled on the altar, and that blood would simply just represent, as it was just raining down over this altar, just a cleansing. Think of it as sin-scrubbing soap is what that blood represented. Okay? And as long as that blood would come on there, that perfect lamb's blood would go on that altar, the nation's sins would be cleaned. And then God would look upon his people and see nothing but clean. See, whenever God doesn't see sin, he doesn't have the wrath. He has to have wrath against sin. It's against him. Okay? But when that sin's gone, he no longer has that wrath. So therefore, no wrath on you. But the problem was, they were temporary. You'd slaughter a lamb. A little while later, you have to do it again, you have to do it again, and you have to do it again just to keep yourself clean and keep yourself away from the wrath of God. That's this idea of a sacrificial lamb. So Jesus chose to take that on, to take on the image of a sacrificial lamb, but this wasn't a over and over and over again thing. He was big enough, it was one time and done. One time. These other lambs, you'd sprinkle the blood, eventually they'd go away and everything. We're talking about the blood of Christ that goes on and never leaves. It is a consistent state of cleaning and forgiveness, and that's what the blood of Christ offers us, because he chose to be our sacrificial lamb. And only he was worthy enough to do that. I want to go ahead and jump to Revelation chapter 5, because I love that this kind of paints the picture of everything we're talking about. And it's this picture of the slain lamb entering the throne room of God. Okay, now obviously Revelation is this, it's apocalyptic literature, okay, so it gets a little weird with imagery, okay, so there's some things in chapter 5, I'm like, okay, I don't really understand what that means, but we can get an idea, okay, but we have the slain lamb entering the throne room of God, and whenever he gets in there, he's called worthy, and the first thing I want us to realize in this, what made him worthy was not walking in as King Jesus, but walking in as the sacrifice. It was his sacrifice that made him worthy. Okay? So let's continue on. So he gets into the throne room and he opens the scroll that only he was worthy to open. And there's many different things that the scroll could be. It could be the history of the entire world. Could be the Old Testament. I don't know. It could be a book by J.R.R. Tolkien. I don't know. But we don't really know what's on the scroll. We just know he is the only one worthy enough to open it and read from it. And that's what you need to catch, is that he's the only one that can do it. And he can only do it because he was the sacrificial lamb. I want to read verse 10. Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation, and you have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on earth. Christ died, covered our sins, yes, that we could be forgiven, but so we could be brought into a nation of people. We're brought into a kingdom. Now, we don't need to get into the fact that, everyone in the kingdom has a job and we need to be working in the kingdom. That's another message, but we get the idea. But we're brought into this kingdom because of what Christ did. And verse 13, real quick. To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might. For how long? Forever and ever. Jesus' blood never washes away, but it always washes you. Always. There is never a sin too grand that is larger than what King Jesus paid for when he became the Lamb. So why do we battle against an authority that died for you? It's an interesting question. I'm going to work my way towards closing here. And I want to go back to Psalms 2, like the very last line. And that is this idea of taking refuge in him. This is a big one. What does it mean to take refuge in Jesus? One of the most powerful scenes in cartoon history is the scene in Disney's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. I don't know if anyone's ever seen that one, but it's like the climax of the movie. And Quasimodo, the hunchback himself, is up on the tower of Notre Dame, and he's chained to the columns, and he can't move. He's just hanging there. He's chained up and bonded, right? And the damsel in distress, named Esmeralda, is down below on a platform covered with logs and tied to a stake because she's getting ready to be burned as a witch. Totally G-rated, I promise. Anyways, you're going to be burned as a witch, okay? And the guy who's getting ready to burn her, actually propositions her, and she spits in his face, and it's this big dramatic scene. But it ends with Quasimodo finally breaking the chains that are holding him to Notre Dame, and he uses that chain to swing down like Tarzan, grab Esmeralda from the flames, and carry her all the way back up to Notre Dame, holding her up, yelling, "Sanctuary!" Now, this idea of sanctuary in a church is actually originated from pagan rituals that the Romans did in their temples. And it was this idea that, murderers and thieves and all this could run into a temple, claim sanctuary, and nobody could harm them or arrest them, anything like that, as long as they stayed in the temple. Now, centuries passed, and eventually Roman Catholicism adopted this. Thus, you have the ritual of going to a church and claiming sanctuary. And as long as you stayed in the church, you couldn't be touched. You couldn't be arrested. You couldn't be harmed. They can't go in and drag you out of the church. Nothing like that, okay? That's what sanctuary is, okay? This is the idea of taking refuge in Christ, okay? Think about this. Have you ever in your life thought about running to Christ and just claiming sanctuary? So that way the enemy and this world has nothing on you. They can't harm you, they can't get to you, because you have this barrier called the kingdom of God. And here's the other thing, right? They can't touch you as long as you don't leave. Once you enter the kingdom of God and claim sanctuary, you don't want to leave. This is the place to be, right? It's where you're safe. It's where God can protect you. Life isn't perfect in there, but you're with him. And you claim sanctuary, and you take refuge in his power and his authority, and you finally give up saying, I don't want to rule myself anymore, Lord. King Jesus, I give you the power over my life. That's taking refuge. That's claiming sanctuary. I want to go ahead and invite the worship team to come up. And I want us to think about this idea, and maybe you want to take out a piece of paper and just draw a little box, okay? You don't have to, but maybe just do it in your head, a mental picture of this box in your head. On the outside of this box, you have all the things that the world can throw at you. Temptations and hardships, anything like that, okay? Think of all that stuff and put yourself inside this box. And I want you right now in your hearts to just claim sanctuary. Claim sanctuary. Take refuge in the authority and the power of the slain Lamb and the King Jesus. Because like it or not, he has all authority here. All of it.